Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, the podcast where two mental health professionals sit down and talk about their mental health journeys and how they navigate mental wellness while working in the mental health field. Today, I am joined by a very special guest. Kate Sayers is my guest today. Kate, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited.
Yeah, this is your first podcast?
No, this is actually my second.
Oh, nice. Somebody else beat me to it.
Yeah, it was actually Kelly who on Instagram is the private practice pro.
Sure.
Have you seen her?
Yeah.
So that was a very intimidating first podcast.
Yeah.
Incredibly intimidating. I feel
Yeah.
like I worked out some of the kinks.
That's good. This
Yeah.
one's very chill
I'm ready
comparatively.
for it.
So what I always like to start with asking people is, how did you get into the profession?
Yeah, it's such a huge question probably for
Yeah.
everybody. Um, I have a very first early memory of being in elementary school and a friend telling me you should be a therapist when you grow up. And then fast forward however many years, I started my bachelor's degree thinking I'm going to go into elementary education. And then maybe a class and a half in, realized absolutely not.
Sure.
And pivoted to psychology. I took a Psych 101 course and was just like enamored and really intrigued. Um, and then that snowballed into being a therapist.
Nice.
So
I'm very curious what happened in elementary school that made someone say you should be a
I wish
therapist.
I knew more behind that story, but it's that core memory. Probably because I was a good listener,
Hmm.
and really curious. I like to know the why behind all of the things.
Yeah,
So probably those two things.
sure.
Yeah.
So then undergrad switched to psych and just kind of stayed psych. Did you know you wanted to do therapy from that point, or was it kind of a meandering process still in undergrad and grad school?
I love that word, meandering, absolutely.
Hmm.
I took the Psych 101 course, was really intrigued, took more courses, and then finally switched my major. And I got into a very oddly specific psych lab to do some research with people. And the clinical terms are enuresis and encopresis, meaning trouble going to the bathroom for
Yeah.
kiddos, which was not something that I was ever interested in at all. But was like, maybe I'll do research. I don't know. I published a poster, which was like a tiny, tiny claim to fame.
Yeah.
And then really after that realized, no, research is not my thing. I think it's more therapy. So
Hmm.
then pivoted after that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Were you like LCSW, LPC? Did you kind of know what you were wanting to do there, or was that a little bit of like figure it out as you go as well?
Figure it out as you go as well. That's kind of my nature.
Sure.
So psychology is a really general degree that you can get, and you can probably go into social work, counseling, etc.
Hmm.
Get your PhD, which some of my friends did. But I'm an LPC. But my first job after graduating with my master's degree was a very social worky kind of job as a case manager.
Sure.
So in a way, I'm glad I started with that first job. It taught me a lot about social work
Yeah.
and yeah, it gave me a lot of appreciation for being a case manager. It's a tough, tough job.
Sure. This is a little bit of a theme on the podcast that I get into.
Yeah.
There's a weird, I've used the term predatory nature
Yeah.
to psychology in that you have these 24, 26, whatever year olds who don't have much experience, pretty much know how to do like an intake and maybe a treatment plan, and that's it. And then they get thrown into these like high stress jobs because at least my impression of it at the time was that was all that was available to us.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
especially if you're working on getting your hours or you're in
Yes.
you have your degree but you're in training license so you can't
Yes.
do a whole lot.
Yes.
Um, so I'm curious if that like kind of fits for where you're at and how you ended up in kind of a case managery job as opposed to maybe more of what you were wanting to do.
100%. And if people could see me, I'm smiling really, really hard right now. But yes. So I graduated with my master's degree and was like a super squeaky clean green therapist thinking I'm going to save the world. And nobody would hire me. This was before this huge boom in mental health services. I think it
Hmm.
was really hard to get into somewhere without having your 3,000 hours.
Hmm.
So I went back to the job I was doing in college for a year and like took a break. And in that time, got some advice from other people who had graduated saying, hey, if you're having a hard time, because I think a lot of us were having a hard time getting a job right out of school, go the case manager route. And so that's the route that I took.
Sure.
And I'm glad I did. I learned a lot, but yeah, it was a crash course in
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah, I go back and forth on it because I think a lot of people have similar stories and they land with like, I learned a lot.
Yes.
And like I have that too. Like my first internship location was a homeless shelter. And
Yep.
like
Yep.
I didn't know what I was doing. I was doing narrative therapy at that time. So
At a
it was,
homeless shelter too.
yeah,
Yeah.
which is unhelpful
Yeah.
in every way, shape, and form for people who don't have their basic needs met. And I'm doing narrative stuff with them. But it was one of those things where it's like, right, then I was at a low fee clinic. This was before the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah.
And so people who didn't have any resources, and it was like, I can see looking back on it and the way that it was explained to me at the time was like, it will never be harder than this.
Yeah.
But also, it's such a weird way to set up the profession to have
Yeah.
a bunch of people who don't know what they're doing,
Yeah.
working with some of the most intense
Or even
clientele they're
people
ever
who
going to
have a
have.
really high need,
Yeah.
right? Like they're really acute. They have a really intense need for somebody who is a good, seasoned clinician.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And probably like multiple resources. So, like when I was at the Lofi clinic, like we didn't have social workers on staff. It was just us therapists because it was a training site.
Holy
And I
cow.
was like, right, these people just need a case manager. These people need someone to
Yeah.
help them with their medication. And like,
Yeah.
I was like, well, it's Milwaukee. There aren't great resources. So I'll give you a
Yeah.
couple options, call around. And like, yeah, looking back, I'm like, that cannot have been that helpful for people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a weird experience. And I think even I relate a lot to your story with the undergrad part too, because
Yeah.
I was at University of Minnesota,
Yeah.
huge research institution, and I got put on the Minnesota Twin Study, which is
Yeah.
this really big deal. And as an undergrad, you don't do anything.
Yeah.
Like I was doing data
Yes.
data entry and like calling people who hadn't
Yes.
filled their surveys
Yes.
out. So it was like cool to sit in on the meetings and hear the people who were actually running stuff, but I had a similar experience of like, right, research is not for me. Like I
Hmm.
want to be working directly with people and helping them.
Hmm.
Um, what was your journey like to kind of go from an agency job that maybe wasn't your dream job to like the point now where you are running your own place and you're doing private practice and like
Yeah.
what was that progression like for you?
Yeah, yeah, I love that question. So I knew in the agency job because it was very much like med management, help folks manage money, deliveries, take them to appointments. Like people were really struggling to stay out of the mental health complex. So it was a high stress job. We were often on call and we had to rotate being on call. So it was a lot of crisis management. So I knew 6 months in that I am to the day lasting a year, and then looking for something else. And it's not to say that it wasn't a good experience and I learned a lot, but I also knew this isn't a sustainable career path. Um, and a friend who I had gone to master's school with was working at a local hospital and they just started their trauma recovery clinic and remembered some research that I had done in class on mindfulness and said, hey, I think you'd be a great fit. So again, it was kind of happenstance that I got into that.
Sure.
But that period, I was there for almost 7 years, and that was really, really foundational for me. Lots of great community connections. Um, it was unique in the program that we did because it wasn't only group therapy, but we got the opportunity to do one-on-one therapy and lots of good clinical supervision around that, which I think for most people that are going into hospital settings, it's exclusively group therapy.
Hmm.
So you don't get a lot of the one-on-one unless you're doing an assessment or something. Um, so I loved that job. I mean, that was a phenomenal job. And really the only thing that made me leave that was the pandemic.
Sure.
Because some of the things that they were asking us to do just felt like, holy cow, this is a lot in addition to my job. I can't do all of these extra things anymore. I need to pivot again.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And did you pivot to like just straight virtual for a while, or did you like start figuring out what private practice was going to look like? A bit of a
I
meandering approach again.
Yeah, yeah. I decided I'm not going to be in the hospital setting anymore. I want to do outpatient. And I had interviews with two agencies and ended up choosing one first and worked there for almost a year. Um, and then we were talking a little bit before about some unethical question mark things that were happening. I started to get some of those intuitive feelers happening, and nothing that I would say is like reportable or
Hmm.
anything, but enough of an intuition that said this doesn't feel like a good fit for me. And so I ended up leaving and going to the other practice that I interviewed with, and really loved that one. Was pretty wedded to staying there indefinitely. But then they got bought out
Yeah.
by a huge corporation.
Mhm.
And I decided to pivot again and just take the leap. So I did meander into my own private practice. So I don't know that I would ever do this again, but I think it made a lot of sense for me at the time, working two jobs.
Hmm.
So nearly full time there and then growing my own thing on the side until my own thing on the side I didn't want to turn people away from that.
Sure.
And so I ended up um, putting notice in and leaving.
Yeah. Did you have, this is going to get in the weeds for a little bit, but I think it's interesting for people who
Yeah.
maybe don't know or haven't experienced it, or therapists who are young in their career.
Yes.
Did you have like a no compete, or did you have something where you were at where you weren't going to be able to take clients with you?
I got really lucky because the organization that I initially signed on with and signed a contract with did not have a non compete, but the organization that bought them out does have a non
Hmm.
compete. And I was really nervous. And I remember being really transparent. I'm always super transparent with people, and said to my boss, who I adored, um, hey, I'm starting my own thing on the side. I just want to check to make sure it's kosher with you and that you're okay with me. I'm not going to do it, when I'm on the clock here, and I'm going to do it at home, but is that okay with you? And she said, yes, you got really lucky, because if you would have waited a couple months and signed with the company that bought us out, you would have had a non-compete, which was a pretty hefty one, like several mile radius and like several years. And
Yeah. My poor experience working for an agency that
yeah,
was unethical, and I
yeah,
decided to leave. I
yeah.
actually had to get a lawyer, and
Wow. So you had a non-compete.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I wasn't super worried about it because the non-compete was it was for a year, but it was geographical, and I was not going to be. It was for a county, and I wasn't going to be in the same county.
Okay.
But it could have messed me up just if I had lived in a different
Yes.
place. But when I got that lawyer who specializes in sort of like workplace and contract stuff, like he literally laughed when I sent him the contract that I had signed, and he's like, "None of this is enforceable."
Oh,
And I was like, "Oh, well, that's a relief." And so
yeah.
I think that was helpful for me, and I think that's something that a lot of therapists freak out about is these
Yeah.
non-competes because
Yeah.
they sound very legalese,
Yeah.
and we're not trained in that
Right.
except for like our own ethical,
Yeah.
very narrow range.
Yeah.
But a lot of those things are not enforceable. A lot of those things go against even the ethical codes of therapists because you're not allowing clients to choose their own services.
Right.
So I just like a tiny plug for anyone who's stressed about that or dealing with that to be like, hey, probably talk to a lawyer, but also a lot of those non-competes are not enforceable.
Yeah.
But when you're having, and which I think is happening more and more, is these big corporations are coming in and buying up mental health space
Yeah.
without having any background in mental health or
Yeah.
having a plan of how they're actually going to deal with it. They just
Right.
view it as a way to make money.
Right.
They do have, much more in-depth contracts. They do have a legal team. They do
Yeah.
have some of the stuff that
Yeah.
for like an individual provider can be really scary and
Yeah.
make you feel kind of stuck.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you mentioned non-competes, because you're not the only person I've heard that has one and had to consult a lawyer. And um, whether they're enforceable or not, probably with the bigger corps they are. I think it's a scary thing, and it's like a
Hmm.
scare tactic for us to not go out on our own. And I think it's like doing a disservice and not trusting the people that you have on your team. Like, you wouldn't it be such a beautiful thing to train someone and be really confident and proud of who you trained, and then to send them off into the world so they can do the same thing for other people,
Hmm.
instead of this like scarcity, let me hold on to all the resources. There's more than enough clients to go around. There's a huge mental health crisis.
Right.
Like, let's trust the people that we hire and we work with.
Yeah. And I do think as you were talking and before you used the word scarcity, I was like, right, that's the scarcity mindset.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. When I first started my practice, I was renting from like a company that leases to small businesses.
Yeah.
So it was like my little office in the midst of like 200 other companies.
Yeah.
And like there were 3 or 4 other mental health providers in that same building.
Hmm.
I reached out to all of them right away and none of them got back to me. And I was like, oh, like we're the old school competitive crowd, I
Well,
guess. Yeah, so it was very strange in that, and I don't have a scarcity mindset about it, and so it
yeah.
was weird for me to like kind of bump into that. I've always been very collaborative and like I may talk to other therapists
Yeah.
and consult and all that stuff. So it was that was a transition for me when I opened my own practice to not have coworkers, first of all,
Yes.
but then have the people who were in a similar space as me, like, be fighting me for the same clients. Like, gang, we're not fighting for clients. Like, we don't have the
Yeah.
same specialties or anything. So
Yeah.
I do think whether it's old school, I definitely ascribe it in maybe an ageist way that I should reevaluate, but I ascribe it to the older therapists who have much more of the scarcity mindset.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then the giant corporations and I think insurance companies
Yes.
lead to
Yeah.
unnecessary competition.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so, all right, I talked myself into it's a soapbox thing for me to get on insurance. I talked myself into a corner here. So, opening your own place, was that like a thing that at all came up in grad school? Was that, did you
No.
have any business training? Did you have any?
No.
Okay. And then asking that question, kind of assuming the answer because
Yeah.
that's the experience. But
Yeah.
I've talked about it with a lot, and we're similar age. I've talked about it a
Yeah.
lot with people in our age group. Like
Yeah.
that wasn't a thing that came up in our training or our grad school,
No.
and I think it's started to shift a little bit.
I hope so.
But it took me a long time to just build up the confidence. Literally working at places that were run poorly
Yes.
finally gave me the confidence to be like, okay, if these people can run it and be making money, then I could run it much better.
Yes.
And so it's really weird. Like I had a class project on building your own practice that was so
Oh.
like unrealistic and like if you had an unlimited budget, what would you do? And it's like, right, none of that was useful.
Yeah.
But that was the only like one project, one paper I wrote on it,
One.
and that was all that was ever like private practice. It was all agency work,
Wow.
take insurance,
Yeah.
etc. So I feel like that's really
You had
pushed.
100% more than I did in my graduate degree.
Sure. Yeah.
Nobody talked about it, and I don't even remember if any professors were active in clinical practice. I think they were all either pure academics or had done something like, a tiny thing way back in the day and had pivoted to academics and then just do that exclusively.
Yeah.
Um, so there really wasn't any mention, and I don't remember in grad school ever getting any, it was so much theory. I don't remember getting a lot of information about the practical stuff. Like, what is an NPI number? How do you get one?
Yeah.
How do you write a clinical note? How do you do these sort of basic things that you're going to be doing every day in your job? We had a professor who presented as part of a like kind of after school sort of a thing for us. I was part of the what is the word for it now? The community organization like of counselors in the program. And we had someone come in and do a presentation on it, so we learned that way, but like hadn't had any experience in classes with teachers talking about that stuff
Right.
at all.
And then when you go into the agency work, a lot of times there's someone who does that stuff.
Yeah.
So you don't have to do it, which
Yeah.
for me was a huge relief.
Yeah.
But also like I didn't never learned it. It just someone else was like, okay, I need this, and this from you. I'll set up your account. And it's like, oh, for young me who didn't want to do that stuff, and I have ADHD, so that stuff doesn't make sense to me. Like that was super helpful. But then when it came years later to open my own practice, like what's a taxonomy code? Like what like
Right.
some of that stuff. And it's really
Yeah.
it's not easy information to
Yeah.
make sense of.
Right. Yeah.
I think somewhat on purpose.
Yeah. Yes. Agreed.
But yeah, I think it's a huge disservice to therapists getting in the field to not talk about what a private practice would look like. I
Yeah.
think for me, COVID, I don't want to say like peeled back the curtain on a lot of that, but like a lot of the stuff that's set up, like I was in higher ed when COVID hit, so we had to pivot to all our college students were going home. They were crossing state lines. Like, what do we do about that all of a sudden? And like a lot of that relaxed, and then it slowly like tightened back up. It's like, right, there is no reason for most of these things. So it's a very bizarre thing. Let's talk about niche.
Let's talk about niche. Yeah.
I always would naturally want to say niche, and I don't know, maybe that's the
Say whatever makes
the
sense
old
for you.
Wisconsin person in me. Yeah, how'd you kind of land on working with your clientele that you like to work with? I know you talked about working at a trauma specific place and
Yeah.
getting that being foundational for you.
Yeah.
How'd you kind of
Yeah.
tie that to a specific clientele or a group of people that you kind of build your caseload around?
Yeah. I knew after leaving the job in the hospital setting that trauma was going to be my bread and butter. Like I felt really comfortable and confident and excited about working with that population, trauma and PTSD, and knew that there was a huge need in the community for providers who are really skilled in treating it because when I was working in the hospital, it was really hard to find a huge wealth of providers. It was like a couple that I trusted. I think it's gotten a lot better now. Um, but so trauma, absolutely. And then I'm queer, so I knew I wanted to serve my community in that
Mm-hmm.
way. Um, and anxiety disorders. I love that. I mean, I feel really fulfilled by all of those things. And probably in some ways because I relate to all of those things.
Sure.
Um, and that was like the bulk of my training. So those were the three specialties. And I would say um conservatively, maybe 80% of my caseload is in the queer community, if
Mm-hmm.
not 90 or 95.
Sure.
And it sort of just happened that way. I think again there was a need in the community, probably much like religious trauma,
Mm-hmm.
where there's there's not a lot of providers. I think there's more now, but certainly like 5 or 6 years ago, there wasn't a lot of providers who said, "Hey, not only am I a member of the queer community, but I specialize in treating the queer community too."
Yeah.
So
Right. Yeah.
those are my things.
Which is awesome. Um, Not to harp on grad school, but
Let's do it.
I think it's helpful for people to understand a little bit of like why our profession is so odd. Um, None of those things sound like things that you were taught in grad school,
Yeah.
right? So those are all things that you're picking up after either through experience
Yeah.
or seeking out trainings on your own.
Yeah. Yeah. I was grateful in that I in grad school took a trauma certification.
Mm-hmm.
So that was really helpful. And honestly, that was probably my favorite class because it not only was the theory behind it, but it was so much practical. And here's how you take this and translate this to a therapy session.
Sure.
Here are all these different modalities that are used to treat trauma. And that was really helpful. So
Mm-hmm.
I did get that training. I think now there's more certifications for being an ally or an LGBTQ uh, serving professional,
Yeah.
but I don't think that was an option when we were in grad school.
Yeah.
I don't remember that.
No.
Yeah.
I remember taking a multicultural class and
Yes.
it wasn't great.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but that was, I mean, when was I in grad school? 2009.
Yeah.
And so it was just one of those things where it was so bizarre. Like
Yeah.
there was an awareness of things
Yes.
around like multicultural things
Yeah.
and different identities, but it had not saturated the culture at large like it
Yeah.
has now,
Right.
where we didn't have a full generation growing up
Yeah.
knowing terms like this. It was
Right.
still like, it was better than it was back in
Yeah.
the day, but it still wasn't like it is now. So
Yeah.
I think that has grown a lot. We talked about this before I started recording, so we can go back to it. Like
Yeah.
I'm wary of some of those certifications because there is an aspect of like therapists getting paid by other therapists because we have to
Yeah.
get CEUs and things
Yeah.
like that. And we
Yeah.
talked about some of our trainings not being particularly helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I know therapists are always kind of like, any good trainings on this? And like, so
Yeah.
at least in the community of therapists that's looking for
Yeah.
good referrals, but there's a lot of stuff. I know I interviewed somebody who does IFS earlier, and like
Yeah.
IFS is trendy, I would say, in the trauma community, but
Mm-hmm.
also like super locked down to get
Mm-hmm.
trainings. You have to
Mm-hmm.
go through a certain person,
Mm-hmm.
and there's like a year-long wait list. Like
Oh my
again,
gosh.
it's not
Yeah.
conducive to how do we help the most people as quickly as possible.
Right.
It's been
How do we monetize?
taken over by capitalism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard too because so I'm getting my yoga teacher certification right
Hmm.
now, which is really exciting.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Um and Where was I going with this? It's hard. It's hard because I understand as business owners, we want to be compensated for the knowledge that we have and
Mhm.
disseminating that to other people. And it's hard to monetize some of these things. Like I don't want to make money necessarily off of teaching people how to be culturally competent. I feel like we should be doing that for free and some. So it's a hard balance
Right.
with CEUs and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. Um, it is, and like I'm a marriage therapist, so I grew up with Gottman being like the bread and butter, the
Yeah.
here's your source of all the research you will ever need.
Yeah.
But even that, like, and this was early in my career, seeing like, oh, this has like stopped being useful and has just started being like publish a new book every 3 or 4 years that has
Yeah.
the same information,
Yeah.
so you can keep making money off of it.
Yeah.
Like, I think I only have one Gottman book on my bookshelf because the
Yeah.
first one he wrote was like the same information
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
gotten 30 years of his career out of.
Yeah.
Um,
Tell me what theories you ascribe to now. Not Gottman, probably.
it keeps shifting and changing a little bit as my clientele shift and change. For me, picking a niche was really hard. I
Yeah.
think because I have ADHD.
Yeah.
And I straight out of grad school, I got offered a job because I was going in to get my postgrad in marriage and therapy, and there just aren't a lot of male marriage therapists
Yeah.
around. And
Yeah.
I use marriage therapist as blanket term because I am licensed as a marriage therapist. That's what is actually on my license, but I like to say couples counseling because I work with people who aren't married and people who have alternative relationships. So it's
Hmm.
just one of those things where I
This
don't
is
like the
this is a
language, but
soapbox moment too.
it's
Like
very ingrained.
what's a is there a different way to say couples? Like do we say partnerships? Does that allow for more like poly community to be recognized?
Right, yeah, I
Yeah.
would love to have better language
Yeah.
around it. And maybe it's out there. Again, it's one of those things that I think it's so hard as therapists to stay on top of
Yeah.
like every cutting edge
Yes.
in our different, and when you have more than one niche, it's nearly impossible.
Yes.
But so I did couples counseling for like that's just what I started out with.
Hmm.
So I was working on my hours out of grad school while I was doing my post grad at the same time, which was convenient. Um, but I was the only marriage therapist on staff at that place, so I was like the expert even though I
Hmm.
absolutely didn't know what I was doing
Hmm.
yet.
Hmm.
So I got all the couples kind of filtered my way, and that was nice, but I was also at a religious counseling place that I had a lot of issues with, just from like being young and fresh out of school and being like, we're not doing ethical stuff here.
Yeah.
Like, people were praying with clients before getting consent for stuff like that, and I was
Yeah.
just like, gang, we can't do that. And they're like, we're a Christian counseling place, we get to. And I was like, no, 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 that's not how
Yeah.
it works.
Yeah.
It wasn't a great fit, but it was weird in that like I had supervision, but it was almost always like, let me consult with you on my cases that have couples aspects because you're an expert in it. So I didn't
Oh,
have a lot of
yeah.
like great mentorship. I loved my internship and I loved my postgrad. That was fantastic.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like after that, once I got into the field, I was like swimming around whatever books or trainings I happened to happen on. So Gottman was what I drew on a lot. I If I have to pick, I generally say I'm a collaborative language therapist, which
Okay.
is like super niche and not a ton of people know it.
I was gonna
It's
say I haven't heard of that
yeah,
before.
right. Uh, it's not a surprise that I would pick something really obscure.
Yeah.
So that's in the school of postmodern therapies with narrative and postmodern, or
Okay.
narrative and solution focused.
Okay.
So I went through that progression of being a narrative therapist first, I think, and then moving into solution focused, and then landed on collaborative language, which is um, very much about how to be a therapist
Mm-hmm.
more than how to do therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Which for my brain was like super helpful because
Mm-hmm.
you could throw all the techniques in the world at me, but like depending on where my brain was at, I was going to space on them and not remember them anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So I needed more of like, how do I conceptualize what I do, like my work and my role in the room, as opposed to like memorizing techniques or anything.
Love it. It
So
sounds a lot like a kind, this is very nerdy, but it sounds a lot like a kind of therapy that I was trained in, functional analytic psychotherapy,
mhm,
which is really taking into account how is my presence in the room affecting the therapeutic space? Like
yeah,
me being white and presenting femme and in a thin body, like how does that show up in the therapy room for other people? Um, and like using our presence to help move people towards change.
Yeah.
There's probably better ways to say it, but
No, yeah, and I love that. I think when I was in grad school, it's hard to tell if it was poor teaching or it was just my ADHD, which I didn't get diagnosed. I knew I had it, but I never
yeah.
got formally diagnosed till I was in my postgrad. So
Okay.
had my master's degree. I was
Yeah.
22 or 23 at the
Yeah.
time, and that's when I finally got my formal diagnosis.
Yeah.
Um, but like techniques for me just came and went almost as like this is fun and interesting for a second, and then like once I did it with a client, I was like, okay.
Yeah.
So like I like to do some of the family therapy stuff of like modeling where you have them actually like stand up and like hold poses and see how it feels. And like it's
Yeah.
interesting, but like for a lot of clients, it was like, right, this is never going to be like a functional or helpful thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I really needed that thing, that the more overarching philosophy. And then it gave me a lot of flexibility to let my brain kind of go whatever way it felt pulled based
Yeah.
on the clients I had, as opposed to being like, this is how I like to do therapy.
Yeah.
So it let me be a lot more collaborative, and also I think let my brain stretch a little bit
Yeah.
instead of like trying to learn a technique.
Yeah.
And then it's just adding and adding and adding
Yeah.
since then.
Yeah.
So it's been interesting. The religious trauma is the most recent thing I added. I spent a lot of time doing sports performance stuff because I was working higher ed, working just exclusively with student athletes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just kind of been wherever my career has taken me. It's been like,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
I should read up on this.
Yeah.
And the athletic stuff was interesting because I was a high level athlete, and then I had spent a lot of years coaching. So that
Okay.
was like, I had the psychology background and I had the athletics background, and I
Yeah.
kind of like just lived experienced them together as
Yeah.
opposed to having like a framework.
Yeah.
But at that time, I was also building like a department. I was the only person in my department working for 800 student athletes. So like it
Really?
wasn't a great setup. I
Yeah.
burned out when COVID hit, obviously.
Yeah. 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 Like many of us.
So and then building my own practice, it's been like keeping that collaborative language part, and then figuring out like what my clientele, like it took me a long time to settle on my niche and like figure out my marketing.
Mm-hmm.
It's just absorbed so much of my mental capacity, like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I know nothing about business, let me figure
Mm-hmm.
this out.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's definitely not Gottman anymore, although Gottman's on my book. I always joke I only have like 4 therapy books on my bookshelf in my
Yeah.
office.
Yeah.
Like I have a bunch of comic books and I
Yeah.
have a bunch of science fiction, and then I have like 3 or 4 therapy books.
Love it. Love it.
They
I
kind
think
of
I'm
keep
the
changing.
opposite. I'm like a therapy book collector, but I'll read like, half of it or 3/4 of it and then put it down and come back to it like 5 years later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I'm rereading The Ethical Slut right now,
I
which
haven't heard of that.
I had read a long time ago. This is like an updated edition, so I guess I was like circling back to it.
Yeah.
But working a lot with like the poly and E&M community right now. So
Yep.
it's like one of those things where I'm like picking up on that and
Yep.
working to see what's out in the field.
Yep.
It's like I complain about this often. It's a little bit of I don't know, a thing that I get irritated with psychology, in that we have all this research, but the research is almost like 20 years behind most of the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And so like society moves forward, but
Yep.
it takes a while for the field to catch up.
Yeah.
So a lot of times you're reading like, I think what is good information, but I come from like University of Minnesota, peer reviewed is best,
Yeah.
evidence-based practice is best.
Yep.
So I'm like
Yep.
reading stuff and like that makes sense and that sounds great, but it's not been peer reviewed, or there's not like a
Right.
study that's backing any of this up. So it's kind of like playing, where's society at? Where's the field at? And there's usually a gap. So I think I'm always kind of absorbing a lot of books and information in a critical way, and then sharing
Yeah.
it with clients to be like, hey, like take some of this with a grain of salt. If it
Right.
doesn't fit for you, leave it
Right.
alone, because
Right. Right.
it's a newer field, or it's
Right.
newer research, or it's
Right.
newer learning.
Right.
And religious trauma is especially that. Like there's been one peer-reviewed study that's been published in it, and it came
Yeah.
out in April.
Yeah.
So like that's how new
Yeah.
that field is,
Yeah.
and having language around it and
Yeah.
research behind it.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating.
Yeah.
We were connected by another therapist, Lily Rish.
Yeah.
Episode, I don't know, earlier episode.
Yeah.
I don't have them
Yeah.
memorized. But it's one of those things where like I've seen your stuff on Instagram,
Yeah.
and like that's for me, that's where like the religious trauma community is. Like
Yeah.
they're putting stuff out on social media,
Mhm.
and I'm, in the one hand, despise that. Like I don't want to be a therapist who's learning things from TikTok or telling clients to look up things on TikTok, but
Yeah.
also like
It's a good way to easily disseminate the information.
Yeah. And then it's tracking it down, like where did this information actually
Where
come
did it-
from,
yeah,
instead of
yeah,
just taking
yeah.
it at face value.
Yeah, using some really good discernment. And hopefully that's what we paid all those thousands of dollars to get our graduate degree
Yes.
for. But you mentioned working with the poly community, and Um, I certainly do. And then also work with trauma. And it's this, I haven't been able to talk to many people about this, but it's a really interesting intersection between poly and the E&M community and trauma and sexual trauma and how those two things in some people might intersect. And I think um without getting super specific and in the weeds, there is there is some really interesting therapy. There are some interesting therapy conversations that can happen when we explore how does your sexual trauma, or maybe for you, how does your religious trauma show up in relationship with other people, and does that impact or affect those beliefs that you have about sex and preferences and all of that kind of stuff. It's there's ways, and I love that we're using the word ethical with the poly community, the kink community, because there are ways to do it that feel really safe and loving and beautiful. And I think there are always going to be those handful of people who like take it too far, and it's like all of a sudden turns into a trauma experience for people. And then in therapy we try to figure out, where do you actually fall? Is this, am I making sense? Like
Yeah, for
um
sure.
I'm curious your thoughts about
It's
this, because
it is,
yeah.
yeah, it's a fascinating intersection. I think I'm a systems thinker still, ultimately. I think
Yeah.
I was taught that, but I think that is how my brain does it because I have ADHD. So I'm always looking at like all these moving parts. So it's their personal history, but I look a lot at like societal things.
Yeah.
The philosophy of social construction, like we assign meaning to things because society told us there's meaning to those things, not because
Yeah.
they inherently have them.
Yeah.
And I think that's really fascinating right now with kind of where the culture is at, where I think culturally much more accepting, but politically very offensive and being attacked right now for
Yeah.
people in the LGBTQ community.
Yeah.
And so it's like open and accepting and also traumatic at the same time.
Yes.
And that's really
Yeah.
weird because trauma is about safety.
Right.
And so in some places, in some spaces, it's super safe. And in like and culture at large, it's very unsafe right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that's a really weird intersection.
Yeah.
And then like the variable of what that person's actual personal history is. So
Right.
whether they
Right.
have a specific trauma history with
Right.
specific trauma events. I talk a lot about big T trauma, like PTSD trauma or
Right.
little t trauma, which I think most, if not all people have.
Right.
They just don't think of it as trauma because it's
Right.
not a bad car accident or going to
Right.
war or getting
Right.
robbed, but like
Right.
you felt unsafe and your
Right.
brain got stuck there.
Yeah.
And so I think I look at it a lot from like those different interplays of
Mm.
society at large and their personal experience, and then kind of like what's the evidence, what's popping up in their life
Mhm.
as like, is this a problem? Is this causing impairment somewhere? Or
Right.
is it something that
Right.
you've processed or something that you're working on processing? Or is it
Yeah.
a new thing? Is it an old
Yeah.
thing? So like, yeah, I think there's so many moving parts, which is what like I love about doing therapy. Like
Me too.
I
Me
love
too.
how I say this often, like human beings in mass are not interesting. We follow the same patterns almost all of the time. And yet every single person is so endlessly fascinating because they don't do the same things all the time. There's a
Yeah.
lot of variability on that individual level.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then, so I like to do couples work. And so then I have all of that for both people in the
Different
room
pieces of data for
at the
both
same
sides. Yeah.
time. So there's a lot of moving parts, I think.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
the
I
intersection
get
is,
really passionate about sexual trauma, especially because there's there's so much work that can be done to explore, after sexual trauma, like what are some of your healthy sex practices now? Do
Mhm.
you want to be sexually active? Sometimes no, like never again. Do you want to be involved in the kink community, in the poly community? Does that feel really healthy? Okay, how do we take any one of those experiences and like make sure that that your trauma isn't like bleeding into those things, like it's not complete avoidance of that, and it's not like a reenactment of it. So it's a really interesting discussion, and there's so much nuance to it, but I love having those conversations like after trauma. um how do we start doing some values work and like explore um what you think your values are, not the values that were given to you by like a
Yes.
traumatic institution or like society at large or your parents who you no longer speak to. Like,
Hmm.
um, there's so many ways that our niches, whatever,
Yeah.
intersect with each other.
Yeah.
And yeah, curious what your thoughts are about all those things.
Yeah, I think for me, often I talk about big T and little t trauma so much because a lot of people don't recognize what's happening as trauma
Yeah.
in their life, and
Yes.
so like religious trauma, I'll talk about specifically here. When I say I'm a religious trauma specialist, often people are like, "Oh, so people who got raped by their priests," and it's
Hmm.
like, yes, absolutely, that is traumatic, but also like people who grew up in purity culture are dealing
Yeah.
with a lot of trauma, and they
Yeah.
weren't molested, they
Right.
weren't overtly harmed in an obvious way, even though there's a ton of harm that was done. And so it's establishing some of that. I think some of the big T trauma people come in and know obviously there's trauma
Yeah.
and they want to work on it. But a
Yeah.
lot of other people, like their nervous system is haywire and they
Right.
have no real frame of reference for why that's happening.
Yeah.
And so it's figuring out like introducing that concept, working on how do we regulate the nervous system, how do we
Mhm.
start to process that trauma in a safer, healthier way, and then also like right what's going on in their lives right now because we can't just hit pause for 6 months and do the trauma work we need to. They're in relationships or they're
Mhm.
trying to be in relationships or they're trying to get out of relationships, and so what does that look like? How do we like maintain safety? Is it a trigger that is trauma based or are you in an actual unsafe space? And
Yeah.
I think like for a lot of people that's hard, especially
Yeah.
depending on some of the kinks they're exploring or
Right.
engaging in. Like
Right.
consent has come a long way,
Yes.
but I think often like it's still work to say like, okay, consent is there, but like what's happening in your body, what's going on in your brain, like how
Right.
are your brain and your body connecting?
Right.
Like that sounds a lot like dissociation. That's not a good
Right.
thing. Like how do we how do
Right.
we work with
Right.
that without saying like, oh, sex is bad or wrong, or oh,
Right.
your partner's bad or wrong. Like,
Right.
and
Because like
sometimes it
healthy
is.
sex exploration is a beautiful thing in
Hmm.
between two consenting partners. But and there's this really interesting overlap in the kink community of like, um, I want there very much to be consent, and sometimes that can be a way to like explore kinks is like to not give that really explicitly. And so
Hmm.
there's just so much nuance to that, but like working with the individual or the couples or the partnerships and figuring out like what are your boundaries around this and how does trauma and big T, little t stuff affect
Yeah,
it? Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think trauma work is also very variable
Mm-hmm.
because I think for a lot of people, I set the expectation not because I think it will happen, but it happens often enough where like it gets worse before it gets better.
Yeah.
Because for a lot of people, their brain and their body have worked together for years
Yeah.
to avoid dealing with the trauma.
Yeah.
And so when we actually like start to like look at it and like pull it apart a little bit, like their brain freaks out. And that's a
Yes.
very normal, healthy experience, but it feels awful.
Feels absolutely
And
horrible.
so then it's people are like, I don't want to keep doing this, or I don't want to come to therapy, or like I don't want to
Is
read
this
that book.
working?
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's a lot of like I don't want to say start and stops because I don't think it's like that, but it's not a linear process
Right.
when you're working with trauma.
Right. 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 Love that. Was just gonna do this Instagram post where I use my arm as an example. Like my arm can't be bendy like Gumby, but right, like healing is not this totally linear experience. I don't think for anyone. I think there's fits and starts and stops and things that feel really good and then there's a big plummet and then we even out and
Yeah.
yeah, like allowing all of that to look like healing.
Yeah. So what do you do specifically for trauma? Are you a EMDR person? Are you IFS, DBT?
This is such a good question.
Thanks. I nerd out
Um,
about this stuff.
yes. So I got the majority of my training in prolonged exposure therapy, PE for short. So that's what I feel most comfortable in, and I've trained other clinicians to use that. Um, and I did take an EMDR training. I have done some trainings on CPT, trauma focused CBT. So I like to be as up to date about stuff as I can. But I would say if I have to pick one, it's probably PE.
Sure.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. It's trauma work too, I think, from like an academic side of things is interesting because the research is still very new
yeah.
and there's a lot of exciting stuff about the research. but there's not a ton of
There's
research.
not a ton. Yeah.
And so it's like there in the religious trauma community, like there was just a study that came out that suggested like EMDR is less effective for people dealing with religious trauma than some other forms of it. So
Yeah.
like it's great for me because I don't do EMDR, but
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but it's also one of those things where it's like, right, like similar to any other issue, like different
Yeah.
people are going to respond well to different things.
Yeah.
And so it's
Yeah.
figuring out like building a good referral source in Milwaukee, like resources are limited. And
Yeah.
so it's like having some of those things where like, okay, if you want EMDR, here's the people that I know who
Yeah.
do that because I
Yeah.
don't do that. And here's what I can do.
Right.
Like working with your client who has no knowledge on these different
Right.
therapy types or
Right.
what. I saw something about IFS. Can we do that? And it's
Yeah.
like, sure, we can try and find someone who does it. But
Yeah.
so
It's
it's
not
like
me. Yeah.
explaining a lot
Yeah.
of those things, but
Yeah.
there's different ways to approach it certainly, and it's figuring out the research catching up with the variability
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
humans.
Yeah. Yeah. And we talked about this in our email, really love evidence-based practices. And I think that's why I align really heavily with PE. I also do, um, some ERP, exposure and response prevention for other kinds of anxiety disorders. So I love the exposure behavioral kind of stuff. But was really interested because the EMDR community in Milwaukee is huge.
Hmm.
So I was just interested to see, that's like the curious mind coming back, like what is going on in this community and what are people talking about and how does this work? And, but yeah, after the training, I realized, yeah, PE is definitely
Yeah.
jams, my thing.
I offend the EMDR crowd every once in a while by being skeptical of the research basis
Yeah,
because the EMDR Institute studies always come out much better than anyone else who
right,
studies it. And
right,
that doesn't mean it's bad or wrong or
right,
ineffective. That
right.
just gives me pause.
Yeah,
And
same.
it's not something that I'm super interested in getting trained in.
Yeah,
Brain spotting was hot for a second, and I
yeah,
thought about doing that, and that seems too hokey for me. So
yeah,
there's some awareness, self-awareness on my part to be
yeah,
like, this isn't
not for
stuff that I
me.
can do.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
like a lot of the somatic work, and
Mm-hmm,
DBT is the thing
mm-hmm.
that I draw from most heavily, but like
Love
definitely
DBT.
pulling out some of the somatic stuff and learning more about that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a bike path right behind our office, so
Cool.
when it stops being so smoky and we can go for a walk,
Yeah,
great.
love
I
it.
like that stuff. I
Yeah.
just talked with somebody recently, previous episode, who has their office near woods, and they like go through the
Mm.
forest during session, and they do their trauma work by like connecting back to nature. I'm like, yeah, that's awesome.
I love that. And we have a bike path. It might be the same bike path
It
behind
probably is. Yeah,
my practice.
we're
It's they're both
close.
in Glendale.
Yeah,
Um, so I would love to get out there and explore some stuff.
yeah.
Yeah,
Okay, I'm gonna pivot a little bit.
let's.
I love talking about trauma and nerding out about it. After I got my specialty in religious trauma, I
Mhm.
realized like I had been referring to myself as trauma informed, but I didn't advertise as doing trauma work.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that I was like just tip of the iceberg trauma informed, which I think is like a bit of a problem in the profession that
Yeah,
people are aware of what trauma is.
yeah,
But if you don't really like learn about it and learn how to work with it, you miss
right,
so much stuff
right.
that is trauma
Yeah,
first and foremost. And like
yeah,
for years I've been like, I don't do personality disorders. It's almost always trauma.
yeah,
But like that was just like a thing I said, and then like actually digging in and learning like, oh yeah, how do you actually calm the nervous system? How do you
right,
actually connect the brain and the body back together? And how do you do that safely?
right.
Like some people can't do breathing techniques
Yep,
because their trauma is linked to holding their breath. So
yep,
like
yep.
learning a lot of those nuances and things I think is really helpful. I think any trauma training therapist can do is a huge win because
Yes,
it's a thing everyone almost everyone knows about it,
yes,
but to actually like
yeah,
be qualified to work with it is a
yeah.
different thing.
Agreed, agreed. Yeah, and I've taken tons of different trauma trainings and working in the field for over 10 years. Like that's 70%, if not more, of the clinical hours that I've accumulated. And so lots of wealth of knowledge and all these different aspects. I worked with veterans before, um, worked with lots and lots of survivors of sexual trauma, childhood stuff, physical, emotional abuse. I don't want to say a lot of trauma triggers on here, but like people that have experienced traumas with guns and
Mhm.
lots of different things. So I feel pretty well versed in all that, and it's not something that I feel nervous about talking about with people. I think sometimes as a therapist we can be afraid to like um, ask questions or like get some details because we're not comfortable with it ourselves. And
Hmm.
it's a disservice, like not asking enough questions to let them have space to say all of the things that are in their brain because they're still living there. We just need a space to get them out.
Yeah.
And a therapist who's comfortable and confident in themselves to hear some of this stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think education is key in a lot of that. I love I'm a millennial, so I work with a lot of millennials and younger,
Hmm.
and like the younger people who are coming in have so much knowledge, not
Yeah.
necessarily awareness of what to do with that
Yeah.
knowledge, but like a much wider base than previous generations did. And so
Yeah.
I think that's super helpful and can help speed some of the therapy up.
Yeah.
But right, you need a therapist who's qualified in those things.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what's the plan with the yoga certification? Is that to tie in? Is that a separate thing from therapy? What's going on there?
Yeah. So it's funny because I actually have, after this, I'm meeting with the owner of the yoga studio I'm getting my training at to talk a little bit about the potential idea of incorporating trauma healing into a yoga setting.
Hmm.
So I love to be able to tie them together, and somatic therapy is like
Yeah.
really interesting to me. Um, when I was in the hospital setting, I was privileged to work with an art therapist, a yoga therapist, etc., and somebody that was trained not only in yoga but in treating trauma. Um, and really interested and excited to see how those two worlds can come together.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I coming from an athletics background, like I have the view of like a D1 athletic department
Yeah,
is still like if everyone could have access to that level of resources,
yeah,
how much healthier would we all be?
yeah.
Because they have a psychiatrist on staff, they have a dentist on
Wow,
staff, they have
wow.
athletic trainers, they have
Oh, yeah,
nutritionists, and it's like, right, you need that level of holistic care
yeah,
to be able to do it. I'm aware of like a lot of those things without being an expert in those things. So it's like I can introduce the concepts to people. I've spent enough time around athletes to comfortably talk about nutrition.
hmm,
Like how you're fueling your body
hmm,
has a huge impact on how your brain is operating.
hmm,
And
hmm.
so it's just one of those things where it's like, right, how do we start pairing some of these things? I love like the trauma work around the body work, but like
Yeah,
that's true of so many other mental health conditions too, of
yeah,
like
yep,
I'm very passionate about the neurodivergent community, and
yeah,
like as somebody who didn't do meds and was diagnosed later in life, like
yeah,
it's like, right, how do you actually live with this thing,
hmm,
not trying to medicate it, but like learn to lean in and enjoy it and do well with some of it instead of just having it be like, well, and you got to take your stimulant medication every day and it wears
yeah,
off after 6 hours.
right,
Like,
right. And using good sleep hygiene and using fueling your body appropriately with like the right nutrients. Like, how do we incorporate those things and meditation into caring for people, not just do yoga once a week, or not just go run, or not just go to therapy once a week,
yeah,
those kind of stuff.
right, for sure. Um, it's also fascinating. Um, let's talk about what's on your bookshelf. What are you reading right now? What's kind of got your attention currently?
Oh my goodness. I love reading. Are we doing therapy? Or are we doing
Both,
anything?
whatever.
There was a beautiful book. I think it's called The Reading List that I read a couple months ago. That was one of the first times in a long time that I've cried at a book with a book because it was just such a beautiful story. Um, there's another book I'm reading right now, something about a yellow house. I need to know the title. We'll put
We
it
can
in the
look it up and add
description.
it in the show notes.
Yeah. But again, a really beautiful story. I love reading fiction about um soft and tender characters and how our like day-to-day lives unfold. Um, and then clinically, I'm like really trying to finish the attached book.
Hmm.
I've gotten 95% of the way through and I have just a couple pages left, but I am such a pick a clinical book up, put it down, pick it up, put it
Sure.
down kind of person.
Yeah.
So
I'm like a skim read a clinical book to get the gist of it, and then like 3 months later, I'll
yeah,
actually try
yeah,
reading it cover
yeah,
to cover.
yeah, yeah.
So yeah, it's fascinating. What are you watching?
What am I watching? Gosh, this is so terrible. We watch lots and lots of trash TV because as therapists, we just got to turn our brains off.
Yeah, I love it. That's why I
Um,
ask.
yeah, but not a trash TV show. There's a show, have you heard of it called The Bear?
Yeah, with the guy, I know him from Shameless.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yes, it's a great one. And there's probably a lot of trauma in that show too, so just like disclaimers for people,
yeah,
but yeah, that's a little bit of what we're watching.
yeah. Do you find like you like engaging with things that make you think of work, or is that like I
No.
want to disconnect and not have to think
Disconnect,
about it?
totally.
Yeah, same.
Like the trash TV that we just watched, which was, I'm so happy that there was some representation for queer people, but it was definitely trashy TV. The Queer Ultimatum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
But yeah, I like watching stuff that just turns my brain off.
yeah.
What
Which is
about you?
same.
Yeah,
Yeah, like I have gotten into anime after my burnout
yeah,
during COVID. I started watching anime just because it's so ridiculously
yeah.
over the top and unrealistic.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, so like an episode that's 20 minutes is much more doable for me than like those 55-minute
Yeah,
premium TV. Like I love Peaky Blinders, but like
yeah,
I don't even think I finished season 6 yet
yeah,
because it takes too long to
yeah,
watch an episode.
yes, yeah,
I'm tired at the end of the day. I want to
yeah,
go to bed. My
yeah,
children wake up early.
yeah.
So yeah, I've even I think moved further away from anything that might even like make me think of it. I mean, anime
Mm-hmm.
has a ton of trauma in it, but it's over the top and not like I can't do like family dramas.
No,
Like my wife loved Schitt's Creek and like I could not watch it because I
it's
was
close
like,
to home, right?
there's too much
Yeah,
family
yeah,
dynamics that I want to like
yeah,
fix.
yeah,
It's driving me crazy. Um,
yeah.
so I like things that I can disconnect from. Occasionally, if enough therapy friends of mine recommend something and
Yeah.
say it's awesome,
Yeah.
even if it's work related, I'll check it out. But
Yeah.
if it's my time to like unplug, I need to actually
Yeah.
unplug.
I agree. I totally agree. Yeah.
So this is segueing nicely into self-care.
Yeah.
What does that look like for you?
Yeah. So I'm a therapist who also goes to therapy.
Yay!
I think it's really important. So I also recently started to do some clinical consultation with a mentor, and the combination of those two things has been incredible in my career.
Hmm.
Working with a therapist who can help me process and heal from my own family trauma stuff,
Hmm.
and some lived experiences I've had with like past partners, um, has been really, really helpful. And yeah, the clinical consultation piece is huge. And then my spouse jokes that I am a little bit of a like predictable robot in my self-care routine. I'm a Capricorn and so love like structure and
Sure.
routine,
Yeah.
which is probably totally different from neurodivergent brains.
Yeah.
But I love to meditate and move my body in different ways. Working out every morning is super important for me.
Hmm.
Yeah, the meditation and therapy has been a game changer for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. We're in Wisconsin, so we've been under Chicago had the worst of it, but Milwaukee was also pretty brutal for air quality.
Yes.
And like the
Yeah.
past couple of days for me have been really hard because I've
Yeah.
got 2 kids
Yeah.
and it's summer vacation.
Yeah.
But like for my sanity, it's getting outside and moving, and I like to go out on the river. I have a paddleboard. I like to go disc golfing. Like those are
Nice.
my
Yeah.
things that like even like disc golfing. There's one right down the road, so I can go in between sessions sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
Mm-hmm.
like not having that available is like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, like winter I kind of adjust and like
Mm-hmm.
mentally prepare for
Yeah.
like a little bit of a different hibernation type thing. Still do
Yeah.
a lot outside, but it's
Yeah.
different.
Yeah.
But like in the middle of summer to have outdoors taken away has been
Brutal.
really hard.
Yeah.
And so it's picking up. I don't know. I don't mind biking in the basement in the winter, but in the summer getting on a stationary bike indoors is like, but I want my real bike. I want
Yeah.
to be outside.
Yeah.
So yeah, just like a tiny, totally out of our control, but like a good reminder of like,
Yeah.
yeah, self-care is super important, which
Yeah.
we know, but
Yeah.
you don't get to practice it or one of your preferred modes is taken away.
Yeah.
It's a lot of extra work to make
Yeah.
that up.
Yeah.
But you brought up sleep hygiene before, and I'm like super
Yeah.
passionate about that.
Yeah.
I have a Aura ring, which
Oh,
like
I love
tracks
that.
tracks
Cool.
my sleep because I'm a bad sleeper, which is a pretty common trait among neurodivergent people
Okay.
between not being able to turn your brain off and having sensory issues. Being comfortable enough to fall asleep is difficult. So I've past year and a half really focused on it, and it's
Yeah.
better, but I still feel like it isn't the best sleep hygiene possible. So it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, those are the things that I talk about with people. Is like, it's an ongoing process. You
Yeah.
can't.
Yeah.
I introduce circadian rhythm as something
Yeah.
you can change in 2 or 3 weeks, but like
Right.
to actually have healthy sleep hygiene and have a healthy lifestyle around it, it's different.
Totally different. Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's fascinating stuff. I'm a big proponent of therapy. I don't know what your experience, this is circling all the way back, was for grad school, but I had not been to therapy when I was in grad school, and it was like a very frowned upon thing that I
Mm-hmm.
hadn't been. And I went, and it was really useless because I was going because other people told me I should, and not for
Mm.
myself. And then when I went in post grad, it was much more useful because I was like, I should probably get this ADHD diagnosed to figure out what's going on there. So that was much more useful. But yeah, my first episode was with Melissa Hale, who's my therapist,
Oh,
and
I love
just
that.
having that ability to talk to somebody else who gets like the profession, and then
Yeah.
also can
Yeah.
focus on whatever's going on in your
Yeah.
life is
Yeah.
awesome.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Cool. So let's plug Safe Space Therapies, and what else do you have going on? Where do people find you? How do they consume your content, or if they want to work with you, where
Yeah.
do they find you?
You can find me online, safespacemke.com, and on Instagram, same thing. Those are the two places you can find me. I'm trying to get really into making reels because I found that it's really exciting and cool to be able to share my passions with people. So, yeah, you can find me at those two places.
Yeah, and we'll have those in the show notes. As always, my stuff is all at Wellness with Jer. Everything media and social media and all that other stuff I do is all linked from there. So I
Mhm.
just filter all my people, wellnesswithjer.com. Hey, this has been fantastic.
This has been really nice. I appreciate it so much.
Yeah, thanks for
Yeah.
coming on. We got
Yeah.
nerdy, but not too nerdy,
Not too
and it
nerdy.
was good.
Yeah.
So thanks for coming on, and to all of the wonderful listeners out there who tune in, thanks for giving us your time again. We'll be back next week with another new episode. Take care, everyone.